On the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, 1,700 men made camp beneath a mountain in Zulu country and dug nothing. No ditch, no rampart, no wagons drawn into a ring. By mid-afternoon, 1,300 of them were dead, killed by an enemy carrying spears and cowhide shields against breech-loading rifles and artillery. It remains the worst defeat the British Army has ever suffered at the hands of an indigenous force armed with vastly inferior weapons. And the man who chose that ground had written the rule requiring every camp in enemy country to be fortified. So why did Lord Chelmsford ignore his own order? His regulations, drafted for this exact campaign, were explicit. A camp in enemy country was to be entrenched or laagered, the wagons drawn into a defensive ring, the way every settler and every Boer in southern Africa had learned to do it. At Isandlwana, there was none of it. And these men were not ambushed in the dark. They were attacked in daylight, on open ground, by an army of 20,000 that had spent the night in a valley a few miles away, in complete silence, waiting. That was not an oversight, it was a decision, and Chelmsford had reasons for it that sounded entirely sensible at the time. To understand the decision, you have to understand the problem Chelmsford thought he had. Britain had not been attacked. This war was manufactured. In December of 1878, the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, Sir Bartle Frere, delivered an ultimatum to Cetshwayo. Among other things, it demanded that the Zulu king disband his army, the institution his entire kingdom was built around, and accept a British resident to oversee his decisions. He was given 30 days. Frere sent that ultimatum without the authorization of his own government in London. He sent it because he wanted a war, and he wanted a war because the confederated South Africa he intended to build could not contain an independent Zulu kingdom fielding tens of thousands of trained men. The terms were not written to be accepted. They were written so that they could not be. Cetshwayo, who had spent years cultivating good relations with the British and had no wish at all to fight them, let the 30 days run out because there was nothing else available to him. On the 11th of January, the columns crossed the border. So Chelmsford did not think his problem was beating the Zulu army. He thought his problem was finding it. His confidence was not baseless. The British infantrymen carried a Martini-Henry rifle, a single-shot breech-loader, accurate at several hundred yards and reloadable far faster than anything a Zulu regiment could answer with. He had artillery. He had rockets. He had mounted troops. The Zulu army had numbers, extraordinary discipline, and spears. It had some firearms, mostly old and poorly supplied with powder. In any straight exchange on open ground, the arithmetic was not close, and everyone on the British side knew it. So the campaign, as Chelmsford understood it, was a hunting problem. Bring the Zulu to battle in the open, once, and the war ends that afternoon. His real fear was not defeat. It was that Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, would refuse to fight, melt into the hills, and drag the war out for a year while the British Treasury complained. Everything that went wrong flows from that single belief. Chelmsford was not looking for an enemy who might destroy him. He was looking for an enemy who might run away. That is why he split his forces without much anxiety, and why the camp at Isandlwana was not dug in. He had other reasons, and they were not stupid ones. The ground was rocky and hard to entrench. The camp was temporary, and the column expected to move on within days. Drawing up the wagons meant unloading them, and the wagons were still being used to bring supplies forward. And underneath all of it sat the assumption that no force of men with spears would ever choose to attack a British camp in daylight, in the open, in the face of massed rifle fire. The Zulu did exactly that, and they did it because their king had told them not to. Cetshwayo's instruction to his commanders was specific. Do not attack the British where they are fortified. Do not, in his phrase, put your face into the lair of the wild beast. Wait and strike them in the open, on the march, where their firepower could not be concentrated. The British camp at Isandlwana was not fortified. Tetchwale's order did not forbid attacking it. It invited it. The warning was not only in Zulu hands, though. It was given directly to Chelmsford in plain terms by people who had fought this exact war before. Boer leaders with decades of experience of frontier fighting told the British to laager their wagons every single night without exception. Paul Kruger, among others, gave that advice directly. It was the accumulated survival knowledge of every settler community in southern Africa. Chelmsford's own field force regulations, which he had issued himself, said the same thing. He did not do it, not out of arrogance in the ordinary sense, but because he had weighed the cost, time, labor, unloading the wagons, slowing the advance, against a risk he had already decided was not real. This is the trap. Chelmsford was not defeated by a surprise. He was defeated by a correct warning that he had a completely reasonable framework for dismissing. If you're learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover battles like this every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. At dawn on the 22nd, Chelmsford acted on his belief. Reports had come in of Zulu forces to the southeast. Chelmsford took roughly half his fighting strength out of camp before first light and marched away to find them, expecting the main Zulu army to be somewhere in that direction. It was a decoy. The force he chased was a screen. The main Zulu army, the Impi, some 20,000 strong under the command of Inchingweyo Kamahole, was not to the southeast at all. It had moved into a valley called Ingwebeni, roughly 5 miles from the camp, and it was sitting there in silence. Left in the camp was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauling, an experienced administrator who had never commanded troops in a battle. With him were roughly 1,300 men, most of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment, a company of the 2nd Battalion, 2 guns, and several hundred men of the Natal native contingent. Later that morning, Colonel Anthony Durnford rode in with mounted men and rockets. Durnford was senior to Pauline by date of commission. Command of the camp passed, or partly passed, to him, and exactly how that worked has been argued about ever since. Around 11 in the morning, a mounted patrol under Lieutenant Charles Rorke chased a handful of Zulu herdsmen and their cattle over a ridge. The cattle went down into the Ingwebeni Valley. Ra's men followed to the edge and looked down. Below them, sitting on the ground in dead silence, was the entire Zulu army. The Impi was not ready. It had intended to attack the following day, but it had been seen, and a Zulu army that has been seen does not wait. Regiment by regiment it rose out of that valley and came on immediately, without orders from its commanders, in the formation the Zulu had used for 60 years. They called it the Horns of the Buffalo, a heavy center, the chest, to hold the enemy in place, and 2 horns of fast younger regiments sweeping wide on either flank to close behind him. Against that, Pauline did what his training told him to do. He formed a firing line to meet the attack in the open. And at first, it worked exactly as the British expected. The Martini-Henry rifles and the 2 guns tore into the Zulu center. The chest slowed, then stopped, then went to ground under the volleys. For a period, the British line was holding and killing at a rate no spear-armed army could sustain. Out on the British right, Durnford's mounted men had ridden forward to meet the left horn and had been driven back into a dry watercourse, a donga, where they held for a time, firing into the flank of the advance. Then their ammunition ran low and they withdrew. When they went, the right-hand end of the British line had nothing anchoring it at all. But the deeper problem was that the line was too long. To cover the front of the camp and Durnford's position out on the right, the companies had been extended across more than a mile of ground, with gaps between them that no one could fill Each company was firing well. None of them could support the one beside it. There is a long argument about ammunition, whether resupply from the camp was too slow, whether boxes were hard to open, whether quartermasters refused to issue rounds to units that were not their own. Much of that story has been challenged by historians, and it is not the reason the line broke. The line broke because of the horns. While the chest held the British front, the two horns kept moving. The right horn swept around behind the Isandlwana rock itself and cut the road back to Rorke's drift. The left came around the other flank. The men in the firing line, facing forward, discovered that the enemy was already behind them. Around this time, the sky darkened. A partial solar eclipse passed over the battlefield in the early afternoon, and in Zulu memory, the day carries that name, the Day of the Dead Moon. When the order came to fall back on the camp, the formation that had been working ceased to exist. Men who had been firing in ranks were suddenly individuals running between tents, among wagons and oxen and each other, with Zulu regiments already inside the camp. What followed was not a battle. Small knots of men formed back to back and fought until their ammunition was gone, and then used bayonets and were killed where they stood. The Natal native contingent, lightly armed and heavily outnumbered, broke early and was cut down in the open. Almost no British infantrymen who stayed in that camp survived it. Chelmsford, still out in the field, spent the day chasing an enemy that was not there. He was told, more than once during that morning, word reached him that there was firing at the camp, and an officer studying it through a telescope reported movement around the tents. Each report was weighed against what he already believed, and each time the belief won. Tent still standing was taken to mean the camp was not under serious attack. Firing was taken to mean a skirmish with a raiding party. He had already decided where the Zulu army was, and every piece of information that arrived was fitted into that decision rather than allowed to overturn it. He returned that evening, in the dark, and camped his exhausted men among their own dead, so that they would not see the ground until morning. That same night, 10 miles back at a mission station called Rorke's Drift, something over 150 British soldiers held a barricaded post against several thousand Zulu of the reserve, and survived. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Rorke's Drift, the most ever given for a single action. That number was not an accident. Britain had just lost 1,300 men in an afternoon to an army it had told the public was primitive, and a story of heroic defense was extremely useful. Chelmsford was not relieved of command over it. He made certain he was still in the field to win the war himself before Sir Garnet Wolseley arrived to replace him. He was never formally censured. The official inquiry was brief, and a good deal of the blame settled quietly onto Durnford, who had the advantage, from the army's point of view, of being dead. The war did not end at Isandlwana. Britain sent more troops, and at Ulundi in July of that year, broke the Zulu army in exactly the kind of battle Chelmsford had wanted from the start. Infantry in a hollow square on open ground with artillery. It took barely half an hour. Sedgwayo was captured, and the Zulu kingdom was dismantled, which is the part that should sit uncomfortably. Chelmsford was right about the arithmetic. In the open, in a formed position, his army could not be beaten by spears, and Ulundi proved it. He lost 1,300 men because he was right about the wrong thing. He had the warning. It came from his own regulations, from experienced local commanders, and from the entire history of frontier warfare in that country. It was specific, it was correct, and he had a perfectly sensible reason to set it aside. So what should we cover next? Another army that was certain it had measured its enemy correctly, and had measured everything except whether the enemy would attack at all. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're covering a new battle every week where confidence turned out to be the trap.